My name is Sunita. I manage the Innovation Fund at UNICEF's Office of Innovation. We get these up? Perfect. And you may be surprised to hear that we have a venture fund. UNICEF is not usually known to work in this particular way, so I'm here to tell you a little bit about why we do that, why it's important to have a new way of working at an organization like UNICEF so we can really accelerate our results for children. What you might know about UNICEF or not is that we are a huge organization. We're present in over 195 countries, $5.5 billion about a year. But we're also the buyer of a third of the world's vaccines and the single biggest purchaser of pencils. Why is this relevant? Because it means that we can engage with private sector, we can engage with other sectors in a way that gives us a certain amount of power and leverage when we come to the table. For vaccines, that's, for instance, meant that we've been able to negotiate the price down and really increase access to vaccines around the world. But what that also means is that we're quite a big machinery. We're quite slow sometimes. We're quite administrative and bureaucratically heavy. And for often the right reasons. We're funded by governments. We use public donations. And so we have to be accountable to the people who support us. But the problems are growing, and they're growing faster. And it means that we have to find new ways to keep up with them. So before we go into kind of the happy stuff, some of the things that really motivate my team on a day-to-day basis is understanding how some of these really big problems are affecting kids around the world and what we need to do differently to respond to them better. So 60 million kids are on the move at the moment, fleeing from conflict and violence and extreme weather conditions. We know that the planet is essentially broken, which is only going to make issues like malnutrition that's already causing about half the deaths of children under 5 at the moment. Also, half of the kids born at the moment don't have identity, so they're not formally registered. There's no way of facilitating their access to schools or health services. So these are some of the really big issues that UNICEF grapples with every day. But really, we're not fast enough to make a real dent in these problems, and we're needing to find new solutions to tackle them. And what my team does is basically look at where there's new opportunities between $100 billion industries. So industries that are having a huge impact commercially, but that haven't really been leveraged yet for social impact and for impact on children. I'll tell you a little bit more about what some of these areas are. One of our big successes, and we heard a little bit about Messages for Good this morning in the panel, is a platform called Rapid Pro, for instance. It was developed about 7 or 8 years ago and has gone to scale, is live in 37 countries. Over 130 million messages have been sent over that platform. And it's been used for things like tracking stockouts of medication in a country like Uganda, where health workers are subscribing to something called M-Track and allows them to track where medical supplies have reached, where they're missing, and to share stocks across health centers. So this has allowed us to bring down stockouts of malarial medication, for instance, from 80 to about 15% in Uganda itself. Similarly, birth registration, so what I talked about earlier, the lack of identity that kids are often facing, the introduction of mobile birth registration in Uganda helped us really accelerate access to official certification. If this hadn't been introduced, we would be at 38% coverage. Now we're at 68%. Still not ideal, but definitely a huge jump and kind of an example of where technology can really accelerate child protection and results for children. Similarly, YouReport, a platform that now has over 3 million young people engaging on a day-to-day basis on issues that matter most to them. For instance, in Liberia, we heard through our country office that kids were complaining about sex for grades in schools. So kids were being asked for sexual favors by their teachers for pass grades in schools. So what we did is we sent out one poll over SMS to 60,000 kids, and we very quickly, within a couple of seconds, got this result. Now, this is not something that's backed up by a big household survey. We didn't go out and ask these kids face to face, but you can't really deny or ignore this kind of result. And this happened within minutes. So this allows us to act a lot more quickly. It also allows us to see where the problem might be biggest, because text messages can be located to location and different administrative regions in a particular country. The other thing that we're trying to do now is really use the other kind of data that's generated by mobile network operators, for instance, or other corporate partners to track the environment. We've developed a product that's called Magic Box. It's really cursed by one of these product development names that then sticks and nobody really wants to change them. And so we're working with private sector partners to get access to big data that can help us respond more quickly to epidemics, to natural disasters, and to help us map poverty and socioeconomic indicators a lot more faster and a lot more efficiently than we could have done through a household survey, for instance. So what you can see here is, for instance, the CDC map of Zika risk across the US, which was published earlier this year in 2017. This is the map that we came up with 6 months earlier. It's based on temperature data, it's based on travel and flight data between Latin America and the US, and on a model that shows how mosquito prevalence and mosquito movement affects Zika distribution. So this is the kind of thing that we're working on now, working very closely with private sector companies like IBM, like Amadeus. If you didn't know what they do, they're the company that does all your flight bookings, so they're the back end to all your flight searches. They know where you looked at, where you went, where you didn't go, where you canceled your flights, and so all that's kind of data that's inputting into these models for us. Really great use. Some of the data that otherwise can be a little creepy, but that we basically have been given access to at an aggregate level, anonymized, that helps us do this kind of analysis and respond to children's needs more quickly. What have some of these experiences taught us? They've really taught us that technology innovation works when it's done within the context of certain principles. We've learned from years of blood, sweat, and tears that there's a lot of failures that happen, but if we learn from them, they can really generate successful innovations. And so these are our principles of innovation. These have now been endorsed. They're also known as the principles of digital development by over 50 organizations. And this is really what we go by. This is how we assess whether an innovation is worth pursuing, how we pilot something, and how we scale it. One of the things I want to highlight really is the open source requirement. Everything that UNICEF does technologically, everything we invest in, everything we develop or pilot has to be open source. And we work with a number of startups and companies that have really successfully gone to scale and remained profitable while developing open source technology solutions. What I manage is the Innovation Fund, which is really born out of all these experiences I talked about before, our successes of being able to take things to scale. So the fund invests in companies, in startups that are registered in developing and emerging markets to help them further develop and pilot a technology solution that could impact the lives of children in a positive way. So when I referred back to those $100 billion industries, here are some of the areas that we're looking at and that we're investing in through the UNICEF Innovation Fund. Things like blockchain, UAVs, virtual and augmented reality, artificial intelligence, satellites, and many more. But really the assessment is these are areas that have a huge potential to positively impact the lives of children, but haven't really been leveraged enough by industry, by big private sector partners in the way that they could. Yesterday, our office in the Pacific put out an announcement for a challenge to drone industry. So if you know anyone, if you're part of a drone company that's able to do cargo delivery, we're looking for companies to test their technology in the Pacific to integrate cargo and to integrate drone-based cargo into vaccine delivery. So Pacific islands are very spread out. It's very difficult to get from point A to point B even within certain islands. So really see the potential for drones to overcome some of these challenges to make sure that kids are vaccinated when they need to be. So the point of the fund is really to take prototypes, working prototypes to the next stage where we can assess whether they're ready for scale. So we'll help startups generate the kind of data and the kind of evidence they need to then be attractive to other investors and donors. We recognize that financially we're quite a small fish in the pond. We have $11 million, which for a VC fund is quite small, but we really want to leverage that to prepare startups in developing countries to be ready for greater investment, be it venture capital, seed funding, angel investing, or grant-based funding after that. So if you yourself are a startup or you know of any companies that are doing interesting work in this space that would like to consider using their technology solutions to improve the lives of children, this is our website, unicefinnovationfund.org. We're open for applications on an ongoing basis and actually work very closely with companies who apply to make sure that they're successful and actually receive funding from us. So I look forward to working with all of you and hope to explore more how we can use the fund to grow solutions for children. So thank you.
We'll actually open it now, Sunita, for some Q&A. So we have about 8 to 10 minutes for Q&A. So
I was told I need to give up my mic, so I forgot.
Hi, thank you so much. Quick question: Do you have to be a startup, or can you have been involved in a space but doing innovative work? Like, what do you consider a startup, like within the past 3 to 5 years, or?
It's a good question. The definition is probably stricter on the actual solution or the product that you're developing rather than the size of the company. So what we're not doing is supporting a big corporate to develop a new product or a new business line. That's not the idea of the fund, right? The idea of the fund is to help startups in the countries that we work in to grow and scale their solutions eventually. So when we're looking at working prototypes that have initial data that show that a product is promising. So the sweet spot's somewhere in between. We honestly have supported companies that registered like a month before they got our funding. It's 2 guys in a garage, and they don't really know what they're doing business plan-wise. Probably not the smartest investment, but we get a lot of those. And then we get those that have maybe existed for 5 to 10 years, are 50 people, but they're trying something really new, and it's quite risky for them, and that's the kind of thing that we're looking for.
Thank you, that's helpful.
I'm going to show my ignorance here. Can you explain what you mean by open source?
Sure. So open source is a particular kind of license type. Basically, it puts intellectual property into the public domain, very largely, very generally speaking, depending on whether it's software or hardware or, for instance, content. There's different kinds of license types that would qualify as open source. What that practically means is that you would still get credit for your invention. Your name would still be against your product, but it means that, for instance, if you're developing a software, it would be the code, and the code base would be in the public domain, and it means that if I'm in Nigeria and I think your product worked well in Tanzania, I can use it, I can adapt it for the Nigerian context, and I can scale it and make a business out of it. So for us, it's important because it allows adaptation very quickly, localization, and scaling. For us, it's also a way to really support businesses to think about a sustainable way of making money. So what we're seeing now is that if your whole business model is based on intellectual property, chances are you're not going to go very far, because China's going to copy your product in the next 5 years. So if you as a business have come up with revenue streams and a way of making money that's really about creating value for your company, you have an added value service, it's based on the expertise of your team, then you may not see that hockey stick growth right at the beginning, but over time you'll actually be more sustainable and keep generating revenue. And we've seen many companies that you probably don't even realize are open source actually go to scale with that kind of model.
Hi, Sunita. Can you talk a little bit about your venture fund? You said you had about 11 million. How long has it been around? Where's the lion's share of the funding coming from? And does an investor have the ability to look at your website and get a good understanding of the decision-making process of who you invest in and that type of thing?
Sure. So the fund has been around, feels like a very long time, probably about 2 years. The contributions are made by, at the moment, 4 main donors or investors. They come from governments. So we have two government partners, the government of Denmark and the government of Finland. We have a corporate partner, the Walt Disney Company, who contributed to the fund, and a significant philanthropic foundation who would like to remain unnamed, who also made a significant contribution to the fund. The website, so if you go to unicefinnovationfund.org, it's actually a real-time reporting website, so you'll see in real time how much money has been spent, where it's been allocated, so which companies or which projects have received funding. And each company that receives funding has to generate data in real time so that anyone can see if they're basically succeeding or failing. Very scary idea for them and for us. So as UNICEF, we're used to getting data, being able to make it nice and submit a report at the end of the year. That's not really happening anymore. We have no control over what people see. So they can see whether the company is really developing the software that they committed to, whether they have the number of users they said they would. We have to be public about our decision-making criteria. So all of that you can also see on the website.
Hi. So some of the examples you cited, a few of them had to do with data aggregation and you guys gleaning insights from that, like the Zika map and also the Sex for Grades survey. So I was curious, are you responding to that with UNICEF resources on the ground, or are these insights that you're going to include in publicized reports? What are you doing with the results of these projects?
So that's the big challenge, right? So all this technology allows you to now collect data and look into data in real time. The problem is us, humans. We're used to not having to respond as quickly as the data now would actually allow us to. And so the biggest challenge for us rolling out these kinds of platforms has not been the technology, it's not been collecting the data, it's actually getting people to use it and respond so much faster than they're used to doing before. In the Liberia example, yes. So our office worked with kind of 2 relevant ministries to make sure that hotlines were set up, teachers, there were consequences for teachers in those particular schools. The other poll we did with kids was to find out whom they would speak to if they actually experienced something like that. Would it be their friends, teachers, the police, peers, etc.? And so absolutely, the idea is always that there's a response fed into that. Most of these systems that I talked about in terms of the medical supply tracking, for instance, is not actually owned by UNICEF, it's actually owned by the government in those countries. So UNICEF plays a role in strengthening those government systems, helps them set it up, helps them understand what the data is telling them, but really the idea is that that would be part of any regular data collection and analysis system that any government usually does around education or health.
We have time for one more.
Hi. I'm just curious, seems like a great model. I love the model. I'm wondering if there are other big NGOs. I feel like I've heard of some other NGOs that are doing something similar, some way to essentially stimulate innovation in the kind of the humanitarian sector. And I wonder if you can talk about what others are doing.
So I can talk probably more knowledgeably about what the UN is doing rather than other large NGOs, but I can maybe mention a few names. So the UN, every UN agency by now has something similar to what we have in terms of a dedicated team for innovation. What they do is very different in each case. A lot of them are largely focused on internal innovation, so really getting their staff to think up of new ideas and encouraging that kind of culture. It's not something that's really very inherent in the UN system. We don't have a lot of financial or other flexibility, so anyone who's ever worked with public funds will understand this. We're not exactly encouraged to take risks and to fail, so a lot of these teams have that role of building up that culture internally and creating that flexibility for UN organizations to explore and pilot new ideas. And that's really where a lot of this came from. The fund was set up because we felt we weren't able to do things fast enough. So, it took us about 6 or 7 years to get Rapid Pro to the point where it is now, and that's just too slow. We can't move that slow with all the products that we need to get out there. And so the idea is to invest in startups that could work in parallel and contribute to an open source tech solution that could ultimately go to scale and hopefully shrink that time frame down to 1 or 2 years rather than 6 or 7. In terms of international or bigger NGOs, I'm less familiar with the US scene actually, but again, most big, like the Red Cross has a big kind of innovation strategy. We work very closely with them, particularly on the mobile-based solutions, to see how we can support Red Cross workers that are active in conflict zones and emergency responses. So.
Great. Thank you, Sunita.
There we go.
And I forgot to mention Sunita is on the Collaborative Leadership Council, and she'll be sticking around a bit after this to answer any further questions if you guys have more. Our second gal is Christy Grayness. She's with the Global Press Institute, of which is a Classy finalist for the Classy Awards. Experienced social entrepreneur with 11 years of international journalism experience. And yeah, everyone welcome Christy.
Let's see if we can get, there we go. Hi everyone, I'm Christy Grayness, the founder and executive director of Global Press Institute. Global Press is international journalism reinvented. Let's face it, the business model of journalism has been flailing for decades, and international news in particular has suffered. Do you know that more than 70% of international news bureaus have closed? That means that in a time where we should be more connected than ever, we're actually getting less information from the least covered parts of our world. And we're forced to rely on people like this, that legacy media sends overseas, foreign correspondents, who are by definition elite outsiders who parachute into developing communities only when tragedy strikes. And they tell us the same stories on repeat. They tell us that people in developing communities are war-prone. They're poverty-drenched. Right? They're victims of uncontrollable disasters, and they succumb to preventable diseases. These are the stories that mainstream media tells us about the developing world. In fact, 97% of foreign correspondence centers on those 4 topics: war, poverty, disaster, and disease. There's other problems with foreign correspondence too. Most of the time, foreign correspondents don't speak the local language. They don't have authentic access to the social, historical, political context that journalists need to gather the facts that form the most complete truths. I know they lack these things because I lacked them too when I was a foreign correspondent overseas. Clearly, something has to change. At Global Press, we're working to create a more complete picture of our world. And we're doing it by offering a training to employment program for local women in the least covered parts of the world to learn the principled practice of professional journalism. Here's how it works. Global Press is made up of 3 brands. First, Global Press Institute. Global Press Institute offers a 24-module, 6-month training program that offers women in the least covered parts of the world the opportunity to learn to become professional journalists, not citizen journalists, not bloggers, professional, ethical, investigative journalists. Then, we employ 100% of our training graduates to work for our award-winning publication, Global Press Journal. At the Journal, these reporters are tasked with covering their communities over the long term, providing comprehensive coverage of their complex communities that are much more than just war, poverty, disaster, and disease. Our reporters are supported by a robust network of editors, fact-checkers, copy editors, and translators. Most of our reporters don't speak English, so we produce a bilingual news product, disseminating the local language version aggressively in country. In fact, we have more than 2,000 radio partners around the world. Then we disseminate the English language content on our website, Global Press Journal, and now through our new syndication platform, Global Press News Service, which is serving more than 200 media partners in English around the world, helping to not only elevate access to information locally, but also elevate global awareness so that we all understand our world better. These 3 brands form a holistic social enterprise, and through Global Press News Service, we're also generating revenue so that Global Press is becoming increasingly sustainable. But more importantly, our journalism is doing what honest journalism does best. It's increasing access to information, allowing people everywhere to make more and better choices, and ultimately live freer and fuller lives. In the last 11 years, we've trained and employed 181 women across 26 countries. Our journalism has changed laws and policies in different countries. It's changing minds and it's changing lives. But despite these powerful successes, there's one question that I get asked more than any other. Why women? That question used to drive me crazy. But I've come to love it because the answer is so simple. Why not? Across our world, talent is not unevenly distributed, but opportunity is. And in journalism in particular, diversity is extremely important. So at Global Press, we're working to ensure that new perspectives can penetrate global markets, because that is the way that we can all begin to understand our world better. And when this happens successfully, when authentic, honest journalism is disseminated local and globally, tangible social change is the direct output. I'll give you a couple examples. This is Nakasanze Sagawa. She's one of our senior reporters in Uganda. Last year, Nakasanze pitched a story about a hair policy in Uganda. It's a classic Global Press story It's a story foreign correspondents wouldn't know about and that mainstream or legacy media would never cover. So Nakasanze tells her editors that there's a policy in secondary schools in Uganda that forces African girls to keep their hair cut short, but girls of other ethnicities can grow their hair long. Now, forever, this policy was not very visible because the majority of girls in Ugandan secondary schools were Ugandan. But in the last decade, there's been such a massive influx of Chinese and Indian families into the Kampala area that all of a sudden this hair policy was very visible. Black girls in secondary schools, short hair. Indian and Chinese girls allowed to grow their hair long. So Nakasanze did an investigation at 6 secondary schools in the Kampala area. After months of reporting, the story finally came out. Because Uganda is an internet zero or Facebook zero country where people can access Facebook on their phones for free, we boosted this story to audiences in Kampala when it came out. That means we pay Facebook to deliver content to a specific audience. Now, because the Facebook algorithm is based on a community's e-commerce potential, we spent $40 to reach more than 500,000 people in the Kampala area. Within 3 days, more than 250,000 people had engaged with this story on Facebook alone. Comments, shares, likes started pouring in. The comment section of this post started growing longer and longer. All of a sudden, teachers and principals were being tagged in posts. Pretty soon, community organizing started happening in the body of this Facebook post. People saying, we need to have a community meeting. We need to talk about this. Fast forward 6 months, all 6 schools mentioned in Nakasanze's story eliminated the policy at the start of the 2017 school year. A powerful example of how ethical, accurate, local journalism produced for a specific audience can create immediate, tangible change. Just last month, something similar happened. This is Yam Kumari and Shilu, 2 of our best reporters in Nepal. They've both been with Global Press for nearly 10 years. A consequence of our training to employment program is that people stay with our program for a very long time. We pay our journalists strong living wages, monthly salaries, and every single reporter has health benefits for herself and her family. Because at Global Press, this isn't just about a journalism innovation, it's about innovating the conversation around women's economic empowerment. Too long, we've been talking about women's economic empowerment in terms of low-wage service professions. And at Global Press, we're demonstrating what it means to employ women in positions of literate leadership. Last month, Yam and Shilu were in a remote part of Nepal, covering a different story, not this one, covering a story about migrant workers' rights movement happening in this one village. And they were walking back to the bus, and they saw this young man in chains. Being the naturally curious journalists that they are, they stopped to ask some questions. They met his family. They ended up spending 7 days in this village talking with this community. And what they learned was that this young man and several others in the village have both physical and mental handicaps. He is not able to speak and often harms himself. So while this picture looks cruel, what Yam and Shilu realized is that his family loves him very much, and this was the only way they knew to keep him safe in a community that lacks any healthcare facilities, much less mental health care facilities and treatment. Just days after this story was published, an international child protection organization traveled to this village, met his family, and provided them treatment and diagnostic services for the first time. Another powerful example of how journalism from the world's least covered places can create tangible social change for people in these communities. And it's not just happening in Uganda and Nepal. Global Press works in more than 20 countries around the world and is growing every day. At Global Press, we're working to lead the charge to eradicate the discipline of foreign correspondence and let local women lead the way to creating a more just and informed world for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. I will open up for Q&A now.
Christy, this is a really impressive story, and I like your answer to the why women. I mean, why not, I guess, but it is really empowering what you guys are doing. My question is, how do you go into a new country? What's your prospecting? How do you prospect for new journalists, and how do you add more countries into the mix?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have a 6-part matrix that we look at when we're evaluating countries around the world. We're looking for places defined by unhealthy media environments. We're looking at state-owned media, corporate control. It can be anything from a place like Zimbabwe, where there's actually a ton of media outlets, but they're very polarized, either run by the government or the opposition party. Or it can be like Kisangani in the Oriental province of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there's one lone radio station, right? Both are equally unhealthy media environments for different reasons. We also have a very robust duty of care program for our journalists, so we evaluate the safety and security of each community, and then once we decide on a place, we conduct robust recruitment. So we're doing radio advertisements, partnering with NGOs, schools, looking for a really diverse population of journalists. People often think about our work, the diversity is just gender, but that's the tip of the iceberg. We're actually looking to form populations of journalists that directly represent those populations. So in the Congo, we need to make sure that we have Hutu, Nande, Tutsi reporters. In Sri Lanka, we need to have Christian, Muslim, Buddhist reporters all working together. So once we do that, then interview processes, we select reporters. At a recent recruitment in Zimbabwe, we had more than 600 candidates turn up for 10 training spots, which is both exciting and heartbreaking. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi there. I think what Global Press does is incredible. As both a woman and a journalist, I'm so intrigued. But this might be very direct, but in Uganda last year, in the heights of that election, and I'm sure we've seen this in other countries where they shut down access to WhatsApp, to Facebook, to communication outside of Uganda. How do you navigate that? What are the challenges there, and how do you find solutions?
Excuse me. Yeah, it's a really important question. So Global Press is a virtual organization in some ways, in that a lot of what we publish is online. But on the ground, we're very much a bricks and mortar organization. So every country office has reporters, a country coordinator, a program manager, editors, fact checkers, copy editors, et cetera, all working together. So even if social media is shut down, we still have the ability to produce our product and distribute it to local partners. But this goes back to safety and security, right? One of the world's growing challenges is safety for journalists. We see this in our own country right now. So at Global Press, our duty of care program includes physical security, emotional security, digital security, and legal security. So we make sure that we use only encrypted communications, that our reporters have legal representation in country. We have emotional self-care programs, and our desks are tiered 1, 2, and 3, 1 being sort of the most perceived safe and 3 being the most dangerous. Reporters in Tier 3 countries go through hostile environment training, self-defense training, conflict management, and conflict avoidance training. So they are really well prepared to take on this task. And I should also mention that the majority of Global Press reporters have a primary school or secondary school education only. So we're really working with women who are sort of not the usual suspects to become journalists.
Given the huge struggles that most of the press has to survive financially, how is this funded, and how did it start? Was it through foundations and grants? And is any of this, are any of the publications that you're talking about in different countries making money to keep themselves alive?
Yeah, so Global Press is a 501c3 non-for-profit organization. The way that we started, I founded Global Press when I was 25, 11 years ago. Do the math. And I started the organization by asking every person who had ever had the poor misfortune of knowing me for $40, because I figured $40 was an embarrassing amount to say no to. So that's how we started. Today we're funded by more than 40 different foundations around the world, including the MacArthur Foundation, Ford Foundation, and a ton of smaller family foundations and individuals. But with Global Press News Service, we're also now generating revenue. Our goal is that within 5 years, we'll be 50% sustained by earned revenue and 50% sustained philanthropically.
Yeah, my name is Phil. I have a question on the Ugandan school long hair and short hair issue.
Yeah.
During your review, how did you find out that they allow foreigners to keep long hair and locals short hair?
It's a good question, and it's a powerful example of who global press journalists are. Nakasanze, who wrote the story, went to a secondary school in Uganda that had the policy, and so she was personally familiar with it. And now, 7 years out of secondary school herself, she wanted to go back and investigate to see if the policy was still there. And what she found was that in many schools, it was still in place. And as she investigated the roots of that policy, it was really rooted in real colonialist ideals about poverty and cleanliness and like a lot of just really terrible things that needed to be wiped off the book. So it was through her own personal experience that she found the story.
Sorry, another question. How well received is this on the ground?
It depends on the country location. We have wide readership in all of our country contexts. So by the public, extremely well received. It generally takes some time for our journalists to build up reputations for themselves, but in a place like Nepal or Mexico, where we've been for more than a decade, we have millions of readers in both countries every month. Government and it depends. In a place like Zimbabwe or Uganda, Congo, Sri Lanka, we're not the most popular girls on the block, but we have good strategies in place to make sure that we're producing fair, balanced coverage that is ultimately above reproach from these government organizations.
And is there an effort or a goal to get some of these stories into that mainstream press that you mentioned in the beginning that doesn't actually cover any of these things?
Yep, that's exactly what Global Press News Service is doing. We have hundreds of partners around the world now. In fact, I would be willing to bet that every single one of you has read a Global Press story before in a mainstream media outlet without knowing that it was a Global Press story, which is part of our goal. Reuters, National Geographic, right? They're some of our big partners. Some newer media like News Deeply, Vice Media is a partner of ours. So really working to help other larger news outlets really improve the quality of international reporting that they're doing.
We have time for one more.
Hi, thank you for this. This is really interesting. I was just wondering, how big are the newsrooms? How many reporters do you have on staff? How often are you publicizing? Just getting a sense of like the business behind it and how often these women are doing stories. Thank you.
Yeah, different desks are different sizes. You know, our largest desks, probably 10 reporters is typically the largest. Once we do a training in a country, it's usually a very long time before we do another one because we transition into the employment phase where we want our reporters to be producing long term. After 11 years, we have more than an 80% retention rate. So 80% of the women we've ever trained still work for Global Press Journal. So it really depends on the size. Funding is also a consequence. As we increasingly work to build our general operating and earned revenue dollars, we're able to expand into parts of the world that donor communities might not care so much about, right? As you can imagine, it's easier to get money for a place like Haiti or the Congo, less so for a place like Mongolia or Zambia.
Great. Thank you so much, Christy.
Thank you guys so much.
She'll be around after as well for any further questions you guys might have for her. Our next presenter is Lena Attar from the Karma Foundation. She's co-founder and CEO of the foundation, was named one of Good Magazine's 2006 Good 100 for Karma's innovative work with Syrian refugees.
So it's Kadim Foundation, and Kadim means generosity in Arabic, and it was 2016, not 2006, which we hadn't started Kadim yet. I co-founded Kadim in 2007, and I'm Syrian American. I lived half my life here, half my life in Aleppo, and I hope everybody here knows what is Aleppo. I have been working for the past 6 years with my team on helping Syrians inside Syria and Syrian refugees And today I'm going to talk to you about our innovative education programming for Syrian refugee teens. And I'm going to start by telling you how that work started. I'm an architect by training, and I found myself in 2013 doing one of our missions in a Syrian refugee school in a town called Reyhanli, which is right on the border of Syria inside Turkey. And because I'm an architect, I give a workshop called Mapping Home. And the concept of the workshop is I teach kids how to draw the floor plans of their home by drawing a floor plan of my home where I grew up in Aleppo. And the kids get to be urban designers, they get to be architects for the hour and learn how to draw these abstract drawings and design the homes of their futures. Sometimes they draw the homes of their past. And with this kind of therapeutic, innovative workshop, I actually access my own trauma of losing our home as I draw for them walls, doors, rooms, and I tell them this is where I used to sit with my family, with my mother and my brothers, this is where I used to read, this is where I used to study, this is where I used to, and you tell the story of the home through this drawing. And the kids are really excited about drawing their homes. And in this particular classroom that I was in, I had a moment that really changed my perspective completely on what the work that we do and this question that a lot of you have to deal with in your own work on how you measure impact. That classroom had a boy named Omar, and he was 10 years old at the time. His hair was perfectly groomed. He was wearing pressed clothes. He was sitting in the crowded classroom. And when I explained the workshop and had all of the kids start to draw, he did not draw anything. And I went up to him and I asked him, why aren't you drawing? And he said, I don't have a home anymore. My home is not a home, and I don't have a future. I can't draw the home of my future because I don't have a future. And I was very upset, and I asked him the question that I've asked hundreds of Syrian refugee kids over the years: what do you want to be when you grow up, Omar? And he answered without hesitation, I want to grow up to be 18 as fast as possible so I can die. And I'd never had any Syrian refugee child say these words to me. I didn't even know how to respond. And so I sat next to him. I felt like a failure. And I sat next to him and we watched the rest of the class draw their homes of the future. I never thought that I would see Omar again. After a week, our team of mentors, sometimes we go with teams of about 40 people, artists, journalists, writers, dentists. We all go back to wherever we're from, Europe, America, sometimes in the Middle East. And I never thought that I would see Omar again. But a year later, I was in the school doing a program for another group of children, and I heard a voice behind me, and it was Omar. Miss Lena, do you remember me? And I turn around and I say, of course I remember you. He said, do you remember how you taught us how to draw our home? And I said yes, even though I knew he hadn't drawn anything at all. But I said, let's do it again. And he sat down and opened up his notebook and began to draw the floor plan of his future home, exactly as I taught them a year before. He drew the rooms, drew the furniture, a long pathway. He drew a car outside, and I asked him, Omar, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he said, I want to be a policeman. And I asked him why, and he said, because policemen defend the people. And he drew a slide and a swing set and a little boy with a remote control car, and I asked him, who is that? And he said with so much pride, this is my son. And that was a huge moment, because I realized that he had actually gone beyond what our intention was to create positive memories for Syrian refugee kids, and actually invented a memory. And that memory allowed him to be able to imagine a concrete future for himself, with a family and a home and a career. And that invented memory became a lifeline. Today there are over 5 million Syrian refugees just like Omar, with nowhere to go to, nowhere to turn back to. And home itself has become for Syrians, it's a fragile dream. Home for millions of Syrians has been a plastic tent for years, or it has been a storefront, or a crowded unfinished house, or even a street, a sidewalk. And for families like my own, with our members of our families scattered across the globe at this point, home is where the WhatsApp is. We never imagined that it would be this way for Syria. Right now, 11 million people, that's half the population of the country before the war, has been uprooted from their homes. That's almost double the size of the population of the state of Massachusetts. Over 500,000 Syrians dead, 1 in 4 refugees are Syrian, and over 1 million Syrian kids don't have access to education. I would have never expected to be able to even say these kinds of numbers 6 years ago. I would have never expected that, and I wanted to ask, 6 years ago, do you know how many Syrian refugees existed? 0. And now we can't even say the word Syria without saying the word Syrian refugees attached to it. We can't even separate the two concepts of the country and the term refugee. 6 years ago, I would have never expected that my home, Aleppo, one of the oldest cities in the world, really the birthplace of so much of our shared humanity and shared civilization, would be left to be a pile of rubble. 6 years ago, I would have never imagined that Syria would be one of the most dangerous places on earth and the sites of the largest humanitarian crisis of our lifetime. Because 6 years ago, this was my home. We never expected to have to go through this endless nightmare of loss while we are watching genocide happen every single day in Syria. In Syria, every day people are dying from airstrikes, from barrel bombs, from drowning, from torture. Every day people are dying in these unacceptable ways and ways that are avoidable and should not be happening in 2017, including today. So the question for us as an organization trying to put something together that would bring hope to people, hope to families, how do you even function like that when people are living through so much despair, and what kind of solutions can we do when we have those kinds of staggering numbers of suffering, but at the same time we're working with these kids every day and watching them grow up as refugees in despair, without access to proper education, without even access to creating a future for themselves. We had an idea about 1.5 years ago to create a place called Kadhim House, and in Rayhanle, in this place that we've been working for 4 years, where we could take the workshops that we've been doing all this time on a mission basis inside Syrian refugee schools and create a permanent space to offer these kinds of innovative education workshops for the most vulnerable section of the Syrian refugee community that we found, which are the teenagers, both the boys and the girls. Kadhim House is a place where kids can come and they can find a mentor, they can take innovative workshops, they have the tools and the technology, but most importantly, it's a place where teens can be teens again. Kadhim House, kids go there. We opened about 6 months ago. Kids go there and they can take courses in science, entrepreneurship, technology. Journalism is huge for us. The journalism course is really popular with our students. And there's a library, they can learn Turkish and English, they can start having access to higher education and job skill training. And over the past months, we've seen how kids are engaging with the program and how they're attending Kadhim House. And at its most basic level, it's a place where kids can come in a safe place to just hang out, especially for girls. If you're a refugee in a small town, an urban refugee, like the majority of Syrian refugees, there's really no place to even go as a teenage girl, because you have to imagine you can't go to your friend's house and hang out because they don't have space. The only real safe place you can go to is school, and so many of them don't even go to school. So we've been seeing the Kadhim House actually being a place where they meet up and they can be there in a place with mentors and people who can oversee what they're doing, but also give them the space just to be free. And the parents also love it in the community because they know what their kids are doing. And I'm going to show you a short video about the Kadhim House. So, did you guys like that video? Isn't it great? That video was made by Sleiman, who's a 19-year-old graphic designer who works for us at Academ House, Syrian refugee from Damascus, has been a refugee since 2012, self-taught in graphic design. When he wants to learn something, he uses YouTube, and he produced that video. This is one of our interns, Abdullah. He's in 11th grade, and he comes every day. He supervises kids in our maker space, and he wants to be an architect. These are a group of women. We have a full staff of full-time mentors at Kadhim House who we've trained and are continuing to train and developing our workshops. And they are all young Syrian refugee professionals. Architects, civil engineers, medical students who aren't able to finish their degrees, young professionals who are refugees in a town where they could never reach their full potential are now being trained in these workshops and working at Kadhim House. And this is Muhammad, who is one of our students who comes daily, and he wants to be a coder or an animator. So Kadhim House really is a place where Syrian refugee kids can be more than refugees, where refugees don't define them anymore. It's where they feel that they're not forgotten, where they belong, and it's where they can reach their potential. And it's really important to create a place where they can belong. This concept of belonging and who is allowed to belong is such an important question in our time. There are over 60 million refugees roaming the world with no home, and we have to create homes for people on the move, homes in the time of displacement, places like Kadhim House, places that are even smaller than that within our own communities, with refugees in our own communities, wherever you are. And that day in 2013, I gave a lifeline to Omar just by showing up. And that's really the most important message of all of this, is showing up and being there. And that's kind of my hope in the community, as I've seen the outpouring of compassion for Syrian refugees and the outpouring of compassion for marginalized communities, and showing up like what we saw, what was going on in the airports a few months ago. And my hope is that every refugee child will be able to find the opportunities to reach their full potential, and that kids like Omar will find home and not only be welcomed wherever they end up, but they also belong. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. I will open up for a few questions.
Thank you, Lena. This is amazing work. I myself was a refugee from Beirut in 1976, a long, long time ago. Can you talk a little bit about the population in Rehani that you're serving? Do you feel like Kadhim House is penetrating a large proportion of the teenage population there, or do some people come and some kids don't? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the population of Syrian refugees in Reyhanli is over 100,000 in a town that used to have a population of 60,000, so more than double of the population are now Syrian refugees. They are urban refugees, so they don't live in tents. And Kadhim House has a capacity, the building itself has a capacity of having 100 members at a time, and we want to build up to having 1,000 members. So members meaning that everything here, it's free to become a Kadhim House member, but they have to take a 4-week course called Kadhim House 101, in which they learn how to use all of the tools, and they learn how to, respect each other, treat the mentors, how the whole thing works. And once you become a member, you can actually attend workshops and use the space use the space with your friends in a free way. I mean, no, definitely not over 50%. This is also outside school. So the kids go to school. What happens is that they go to school for 2 shifts. So kids come to Kadhim House either before or after school. And we're trying to reach as many kids as we can. And obviously we'd like to grow more. And we're already establishing roots in Istanbul, which has actually a population of over 500,000 Syrian refugees. And we want to open up the second Kadhim House there. So it's definitely an idea where we want to actually create these spaces in more than one location.
We have time for one more question.
Hi. I was just curious, besides sending money, how could we help Syrian refugees over here? I mean, sending money is great, but are there other things that you see that we could be doing right now?
Refugees here in the US, you mean?
Or refugees over there, or just how can we do something?
So there's lots of things that you can do. For any organization that's working outside the US, sending money is the best way. And there's so many ways that you can raise money. You can use Classy for so many different things, and that's what we've seen our supporters do. Because sending stuff really doesn't work. But you can also volunteer, you can mentor, and you can help in that way, and actual expertise in terms of the technology and the actual the equipment that we kind of need for places like Kadhim House. Those are also really important resources. So if you have those kinds of resources, design resources, those are ways that you can volunteer without actually going. But if you're here, when you're in this place, wherever you live right now in the United States, if you live in a bigger city, you will have Syrian refugees in your community, and if not Syrian refugees, other refugees. And it's really, really important for these refugees to feel supported socially and emotionally. So there's lots of things that you can do outside of actually giving money. Refugees need help getting driver's licenses, getting registered in school, getting to their first doctor's appointment, learning how to drive, learning English. And so we actually have a program that we work with Syrian refugees in the US. The person who leads this program is right here in our audience, Hani. And if you have any questions about supporting Syrian refugees in the US, we're actually trying to do something very new that's not being done by the resettlement agencies, which is identifying families that we can actually jumpstart their lives by giving them a bigger investment in what they need to help them get to the next level of getting the job and being able to provide for their families and being self-sustained. And the biggest part is buying cars. That's what we found. People can't actually get to work from the places that they're being resettled to. So if you actually identify these kinds of families and get them a car, get them to to their job interviews or even job skill training, then you have them set. Instead of having them become almost victims to the aid system, which is what we're seeing right now more increasingly with the refugees that are being resettled in the US. So there's lots of things you can do, and the crisis is so big, it's really our responsibility to get involved in it because it's ongoing. There's no end in sight to this terrible war, but the people, these kids, if you see them, if you meet them, the kids here in the US, they have so much potential. They teach me all the time about persistence and determination and a lot of hope. So it's really rewarding work.
Thank you, Lena.
Thank you.